Well, hello.
Hello.
And welcome to The Book on Fire. This is the podcast where we talk about what we've been reading and apply it to the lives that we're all living and the challenges of living this life in these times. We are really happy to be back with y'all. My name's Dave. I'm sitting here with Janet.
Hello.
And this is our very belated season 3 of The Book on Fire.
Yes, it's been a really long time since you've heard from us in this form, at least. It's been since 2020, but it feels like maybe 10 years have gone by in this pandemic era in which every month feels like a lifetime.
Yeah, oh God.
At least our lives have been quite full and busy, and I was just reminiscing with Dave before this about how we managed to do 2 podcast seasons in a row at first, and how unimaginable that feels right now.
It seemed easy at the time. Now it feels Herculean.
Right.
Yeah.
And these are the things that we notice with the way time is shifting, and we are shifting through these times.
Yeah, so it's actually been 3 years since we began our discussion of Caliban and the Witch, which was the last book we talked about on the podcast.
Yeah, we recorded season 2 beginning in January of 2020, and then we finished up in May, and we were reading and discussing Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. We chose that book because it felt relevant to the time that we are in, this current era, and it felt quite relevant before the pandemic began. But by the end of that season of recording, it was pretty uncanny how much resonance there was with what we were all dealing with.
Yeah, that was super interesting because we didn't just pick the book. You know, a lot of people have been reading that book over a couple of decades, maybe more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And partially because there is something about it that feels relevant to these times. And also it's just maybe in and of itself is a pretty important history lesson and a reorientation. But then, little did we know that as we were reading and discussing it and recording episodes in 2020 that it started to feel kind of eerie, actually, how relevant it was.
And we heard from a lot of you that you were feeling that way as well. And also that during some of the more acute times of lockdown that you were grateful for this framing and for this discussion to be ongoing during that time, that it was weirdly comforting to have this discussion that was so resonant with what is happening. And I just want to bring up a few themes that we talked about from then to now, because I think that might be helpful for framing where we're going.
Yeah, and if you didn't read Caliban with us or haven't read it, this is still going to be hopefully interesting. Yeah.
So Caliban and the Witch is about the birth of capitalism and also very much about the violence committed by the European nations against indigenous folks in those newly explored, conquested territories, but also women and their communities, poor women specifically, and their communities back home. So it's about these 2 kind of fronts of violence that were instrumental in enforcing a whole new organization of life onto people.
Yeah, the violence that was necessary to give birth to capitalism, to a new way.
Right.
Yeah.
And we had wanted to pick a book that was about transitions, partially, or this kind of like global reorganization, because for many people who are familiar with the cycles of history, it looks like we are in such a transition. And it seemed that way even before we all sort of went through this pandemic tunnel that we're still in right now that is changing so much about how we live.
Yeah.
In Caliban and the Witch, Federici describes this setup to the transition that she's talking about that shows us a state of Europe that has just come out of a pandemic, the bubonic plague specifically.
Right.
And the plague took out a huge amount of the European population.
Yeah.
and a large amount of workers,
Yeah.
peasants, as they were called back then.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess depending on what country you're in, they were called different things. But the working people, a lot of folks died off. And because of that die-off, and also because of the proximity to death and what that does to how you view your life and how you move through the world,
Yeah.
that suddenly there was a huge shift in power dynamics between the working people and the people they worked for, whose land they worked.
Uh-huh.
And they were able to demand better conditions. They were able to be more resilient in the face of discipline. They could just quit and go work for the landlord next door if they wanted to. This was a very big change, and it was unprecedented in the time
Yeah.
that this all went down. But part of the story that she's telling here is that capitalism emerged as part of the backlash to that power shift.
Yeah.
As the European nations were began to send ships and begin to occupy other lands around the world, they not only stole land and abused the people who were on those lands, but back home, they put in a series of laws that stole land from the common people as well. They enclosed the commons. So part of what we saw here is that the shift in labor power led to like a different strategy in which the ruling class of those European nations needed to expand their territory, to expand where they could draw wealth from to begin this new system.
Yeah.
And within that process, back home in Europe, the people who were working the commons, who lived on the commons, worked the commons, and were working that land, became uprooted from the land, alienated from the land, is one way of saying that.
Mm-hmm.
And then often forced into working in the mills, moving into more urban areas. And she describes a lot of shifts in the way public life and private life was organized around those changes.
Yeah.
And they are mirrored on both sides, both fronts of this violent reorganization of life. So we see stolen land, both in the colonized, occupied territories and back at home,
Mm-hmm.
as being essential to this creation of
The
capitalism.
formation of capitalism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And again, people were being alienated from the land, from each other, and from their labor.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2020, as we were discussing this transition, or formation, or both, a global pandemic emerged. It's interesting because, like the bubonic plague, this virus, this contagion, also carried a big death toll. And we saw a lot of workers, ironically called essential workers, who died during this era.
Yeah.
And we've seen lingering effects from this in the power of labor in a lot of places in the world as well.
Mm-hmm.
Partially because there are less people to work, but also because people begin to value their lives in new ways or think about what is possible and what they could be doing with their life when
Yeah.
given a chance. And so we're seeing this rise in labor power, whether that's through refusal or through more organizing, more strikes. Like, we're seeing a lot more
Right.
labor activity.
Yeah.
And it's
yeah.
pretty exciting to see.
Yeah, it's hard not to want to draw the parallel there.
Yeah,
I mean,
for
even
sure.
though the conditions are really different
Right.
and the impact is very different, it's still reading about the plague in Caliban partially trains you to look around and notice
Mm-hmm.
what these effects have been from COVID that we've been talking about,
Right.
and makes you more ready to see it.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it also made me more ready to see the ways that the economic shifts that were happening also seem to mirror the reaction to that power shift,
Uh-huh.
which by that I mean, we still don't really know what all the fallout is from this shift. But what we can say is that in especially the early era of the pandemic, we saw a huge wealth transfer. As people had to stay home and for public health reasons were going out less, they A lot of small businesses collapsed, while a handful of billionaires and their corporations made astronomical amounts of money.
Mm-hmm.
Like unfathomable amounts of money. And at the same time, people began to exist more and more online, or more and more people were spending more of their lives online.
Sure.
You know? And in some ways, for some people, this probably could feel like a lifeline to not feel totally isolated. But at the same time, the actual, like, in real life connection was shrinking.
Mm-hmm.
Massively.
Yeah.
And the ways that people were relating to work who did not refuse or stop working also became much more digitally focused. And it started to feel like a full-scale digitalization of life was imminent. And that is including all the surveillance and alienation that would mean. And I don't know, it just really looked like, I mean, I personally was like, is this it? This is going to stick? Like, everyone's just going to be online now?
Right.
You know, I mean, that was part of what I was thinking at the moment. And there may be a way in which some of that will stick, although we are starting to see some reaction to that, I feel like. But in some cases, it felt like, once again, we had people being increasingly like kind of pushed through a system in which they were going to become even more ungrounded and disembodied.
Mm-hmm.
And even more alienated.
Yeah.
So that resonated with the book as well. You know, and then the final, well, not final, actually, I could probably sit here and think of like many ways that there were resonance between Caliban and what we're going through and are still going through. But one last thing is that in response to that labor crisis that happened from the bubonic plague, when you look at the history that Federici is describing, you see a huge crackdown on women and folks who bear children and their own autonomy over their bodies. Much more obsessive looking at whether or not people are self-managing their reproduction.
Yeah.
And wow, that has become ever more intense. And I'm not sure if it's entirely tied to the labor shortage. I think that this has more to do with white supremacy in this country, at least in the United States.
Right.
But there is a way that we are seeing that same type of obsessive attention to pregnancy as there was during that time period. And like back when we discussed the book, we talked about different women being punished severely, sometimes very severely in some cases, for miscarriage.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing women imprisoned for miscarriage in some places. And so, I don't know, that resonance also showed up when I was thinking about how much things have changed since we discussed this book. And we were on our way there anyway, right? This didn't come out of nowhere. But at the same time, it is in the same constellation of what we were talking about in 2020, and it's becoming more acute.
Yeah, and we actually had a whole season planned that was based partly on our thinking through the implications of the COVID pandemic and everything that happened politically around that, and the largest popular uprising that has ever been seen in the United States of America, where we live, which was the George Floyd uprising that came right in the midst of the pandemic in the summer of 2020, the early summer of 2020, and the growing ecological crisis and just all these things and what it means for the context in which we act and the opportunities that we have to remake the world in a way that's more beneficial for mutual flourishing, right? And we had a whole big stack of books that was stuff that we'd been reading around that time. And we were going to try and kind of incorporate stuff from all of it. We had a lot of notes, and we actually have some tape that we recorded last winter too, but we had to abort the project. I think it was maybe too ambitious.
Yes.
It partly maybe failed from being too ambitious, and just because of other life stuff. One of those books that we planned to talk about was the book we have chosen for this season, and that is The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber, David Wengrow. It's a book that came out recently. It's a book that a lot of people are excited about, a lot of people are reading, and we just think that there's enough to get into here to devote the whole season to it.
This season, we are going to be talking about The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow.
Two Davids.
Two Davids. And this book was published in 2021. As you can probably tell from the title, The Dawn of Everything. It is a pretty ambitious work that has to do with a lot of big picture topics and the entirety of history.
A new history of humanity.
Yeah. I think that they're probably being a little bit
I wonder if there was
cheeky.
like a committee at the publishing company that helped to name the book.
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. But this book drew a lot of attention when it came out and continues to draw a lot of attention. And we will be discussing it as well as relevant articles and other responses to the work as well as we go, and texts that it leads us to. So we're not going to just stick to this, although we are going to primarily be working our way through this book with you all, our listeners. Part of the reason this book made a really big splash when it was published is that the author David Graeber is a famous, maybe even infamous, anarchist anthropologist. And he had died
just weeks before
the
book was finished.
Weeks before it was finished, and
a year before it came out.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. So many of us didn't even know this was coming.
Right.
And I, for one, was very sad when David Graeber died. I saw him and continue to see him as a thinker that informs how I move through the world and also like what I think is possible. I don't always agree with him, but I find his thoughts to be generative.
Yeah.
So a lot of us were saddened by that loss. He was pretty young. And to have this book come out unexpectedly for some of us was pretty exciting.
Yeah. Oh, we get another Graeber book.
And we get another Graeber book.
A 700-page Graeber book, yeah.
I mean, the sad part is to learn that this was like one of many volumes they had planned to write together on this subject.
Right.
And that part is actually pretty heartbreaking, especially because there's some things we might want from this book that are not in this book that could have been in some of the later books.
Yeah.
We don't really know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was definitely part of the reason I was very excited about it. And I think probably that's true for a lot of other readers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Graeber is probably most famous for, it's funny to say that he's most famous for this, but I think he probably is most famous for having coined the term the 99%. That was one of the slogans of the Occupy movement.
Well, yeah, and for being
a
main organizer of Occupy Wall Street. I still remember well when I first discovered David Graeber. It was in the fall of 2005. Hurricane Katrina had just come through New Orleans. I was doing some migrant work up in the Northeast, and I'd spent a couple of weeks in New York City, and at a bookstore there, I encountered this very small book of his. I didn't know who he was, but I was just browsing in Blue Stockings bookstore, and squeezed between much bigger books was this very small book called Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology. And I was drawn to it immediately. I pulled it out and started flipping through it. That was very exciting to me, so I bought the book and I just read it very quickly. And Graeber is he's just a very dynamic, charismatic writer who he pulls you in, and he has a way of like writing in ways that you can understand, makes complex topics seem kind of down to earth and you can engage with them, and was really quite brilliant. Even though, in retrospect, his contributions have been kind of uneven, and some of his ideas are definitely better than others, and you can't always tell when you're reading them, because you're caught up in just like the fun and the drama and the flow of the writing. This is definitely true of this book.
Yeah.
And it's something that we're going to discover probably or be talking about as we go through it. Yeah, but that was my first exposure to David Graeber. I learned quickly that he was a cultural anthropologist, trained in the United States. At that point, or right around that time, he lost his job at Yale University. He taught at Yale, and supposedly, I never really got the details on the story, but supposedly because of his political views, he was pushed out of Yale, and couldn't really find a job in the U.S. after that. He ended up going to London. He eventually landed at the London School of Economics, which is where he was a professor until his death. David Wengrow is a British archaeologist who I know comparatively little about. He has done field work in Egypt and North Africa and Southwest Asia. And I learned doing research for this podcast that David Wengrow, besides sharing my first name, was also born only 2 weeks after me. So maybe I should learn more about this guy.
Maybe you should be asking yourself, where's your 700-page book?
Yeah, right.
I guess.
I know. Where am I? I mean, and I am older than him, too.
Oof.
By 16 days.
Right. So at the heart of this book, if I was going to just try to, like, condense it down to the, like, nucleus of what they're doing.
Yeah.
I guess I would say that this book is in a long lineage of thinkers and texts that are trying to answer the questions of how did we get here? What happened?
Yeah.
You know?
That's true.
And so to do that, they want to look at some other ideas first about how we got here, what happened. Because generally they're assuming that the reader might also look around them and say, this is not the ideal way to live.
Right.
A lot of what I'm doing, I might not necessarily choose if I had a choice. And it's quite possible that a lot of the other fellow citizens of the society that I live in might also not have chosen this.
Yeah.
And so the question is, if we did not choose this, then why are we living this way? And what led up to this? And then within that, also, what is possible?
Yeah, big questions.
These are the really big questions.
Big questions. And yeah, part of the way the book is framed is that it's a book that asks big questions about the broad sweeping timeline of politics and human history, that the authors think that scholars are not often writing this kind of book anymore. And the people who are people who are woefully uninformed.
Right.
So they're offering to step in and write a new big book with up-to-date information.
Yeah, because part of what they're discussing in this book is that the past, few decades have shown an emergence of data from the fields of archaeology and anthropology around the world that really trouble both the timeline of what humans were up to and when, and also trouble the accepted narrative of how human society progresses. And they are concerned that those findings within those fields are being kept within the silos of those disciplines, and that people outside of those disciplines don't really know that there's been these somewhat revolutionary findings in those fields.
Right.
So the point of this book is not only to make an argument, and they're absolutely making an argument, but to share with the larger public what people have been up to in the fields of archaeology and anthropology and what the implications of those findings might be.
Right. And they want to feed all of that into the political imaginary of us, people living now.
Right.
Because they think that if we want big change, then we need to train our imagination properly. Which all kind of begs the question of why does anthropology matter to any of this, right? Why does anthropology matter? What is anthropology? Anthropology is just the study of people. And to study the diversity of the ways that people have lived is also to study the diversity of social organization that people have and have had. And how people have answered questions of power and who has it and sharing power and division of resources and all of these type of things, which are the questions of politics, right?
I mean, it's almost like people, I don't know, I associate the interest in anthropology in the way that we're thinking about with more dreamers and idealists or other people who think there could be a better way of living. Feels like it kind of goes back to the 60s. I don't know if you feel like that is what happened. I associate that interest in anthropology as being something that, I don't know, really took off during the countercultural movements of that time.
Yeah, that may be true. And there might be a good reason for that. And it has to do with a certain transition that happened in anthropology around that time that's very relevant to the project of this book and what this book is talking about. It was in the 60s and the early 70s that a consensus emerged, first within academia, and then became more widely known outside of academia, that changed people's conception of what our earliest ancestors' lives were like. Because it was commonly held before then, both, just in the popular imagination, but also in academia as well, that our earliest ancestors, what they might have called cavemen back in that time, lived pretty impoverished lives where they were frequently starving, probably had a very high degree of male dominance. There was a lot of violence, killing, war, probably disease, and that these lives were nothing to be envious of. But in the 60s and early 70s, a bunch of people who studied hunter-gatherers and, modern ones and got together. In fact, there was actually a conference where a lot of this work got done, and decided from talking to each other that actually that was not the true picture, and that in fact, contemporary hunter-gatherers, but then extrapolating back into the distant past, that we can probably assume that these folks lived lives of relative leisure, worked a very few number of hours a week compared to what we work, and had a very wide and varied diet that was nutritious and supported their bodies very well, that they were relatively free of dominance hierarchies, and so on and so forth. And one of the major works that came out at that time was this book by Marshall Solins, who I think was definitely a colleague of Graeber's, and they wrote a book together. I almost want to say that he was his advisor at some point or something, but I'm not sure about that. But the book was called Stone Age Economics, and it detailed all of this and became a very famous book. So this was really a watershed moment where people started to think about the broad sweep of human history really differently. And little by little, as this new idea about our ancestors, there was more evidence accumulating for it, and it began to sort of leak out and get more into the popular consciousness, including some of the countercultural people from the 60s and 70s. A different story got to be told where the findings of anthropology were almost supporting some kind of almost like a fall mythos, where we once had it really good in the garden, and had all this food and all these animals to live with and eat and hunt, and all this freedom of movement and all these benefits. And then beginning with agriculture and permanent settlements, and then eventually leading to the state and permanent hierarchies and all of this stuff, we fell into the pipeline that leads to now.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know, I'm thinking about my own process around this and how I've conceived of this, I guess, evolution of human society over time has grown and changed. And I will say that, we're both 50 or close to 50.
Yeah.
And came up at a time when that idea of a fall that led to civilization as we now know it was very popular in anarchist circles and anarchist readings and other social theorists, including some Marxist theorists. And especially this cluster of developments in society, and some people like Zerzan, John Zerzan, might put that all the way back with the development of written language, the development of art as a symbol, and then eventually the development of agriculture. And that all of those are necessary for the foundation of a civilization that is built on domination and hierarchy.
Right.
And in most of those stories, agriculture plays a really key role in the idea of the fall, and I think that probably a lot of us are prepped for that story, partially from having grown up in Abrahamic faiths, where there is not only the Garden of Eden, but also the story of Cain and Abel. There's all of these different
I think that's right on.
myths that really rhyme with the idea that agriculture is actually what we can't go back from.
Right, and people actually reread those myths in the light of these types of findings. Yeah, for sure.
And you find those in other myths as well. It's just very clear in the Abrahamic faith story of the fall from Eden.
Right.
And so I think that because a lot of us are primed with that already, it made sense to us
Yeah.
to think that like we were in more of a state, which we're going to get into some other theorists who might have fed into that as well.
Yeah.
But that there had been a time in which humans lived just in a less stressful way, and harmed each other less.
Less hierarchical.
Yeah,
less patriarchal.
But that once some certain steps were made and some certain institutions were in place, that we lost the ability to have that again.
Yeah.
And that really there's no going back without major catastrophic transformation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is the implication, I would say.
And there was a whole, there was a whole primitivist movement.
Mm-hmm.
It got started in the 80s. You mentioned John Zerzan. It got popular in the 90s. And then by the early 2000s, there was a whole wave of green anarchy, anarcho-primitivist people, even people who sought to, in this world, live like hunter-gatherers,
Mm-hmm.
partially inspired by this anthropological findings, and that's not totally done.
Yeah, they're still out there.
Yeah, I think the wave has passed its peak.
Yes.
But that influence is still there. And that is part of the context for this book, for sure. And in fact, if we haven't said it already, the main argument of this book is an argument against the idea that only hunter-gatherers can be truly free.
Mm-hmm.
And that, because we live with agriculture, that we are doomed to hierarchy and unfreedom. And by freedom, we mean, freedom from coercion, freedom from domination. And, yeah.
And we're thinking about, just to make sure we're all on the same page, we are talking about collective freedom. And while collective freedom involves the individual members being free as well, it doesn't mean freedom from responsibility.
Yeah.
It generally, as we will see when we get more into the text, involves a large amount of mutual care in individual communities and in societies where
Right.
people actually care greatly for the well-being of each other
Yeah.
and are responsible to each other for that. So when we say freedom, we don't mean freedom from all responsibility. We mean, yes, for what you said, freedom
Freedom from domination by other humans.
by other humans. And
Yeah.
so I just worry sometimes that people misinterpret that.
Mm-hmm.
And because we're so inundated with individualist ideas of freedom and what freedom, who uses that word the most right now in the dominant
Well, yeah, because
culture?
right-wingers throw the word around
Yes,
too, and they
for
don't
sure.
mean it the way that we mean it.
They don't mean responsibility
it can be-
or mutual care. They mean their ability to dominate whoever they want sometimes, depending on
Yeah.
who's talking.
Yeah.
Or
yeah,
the right people in power to dominate.
Yeah, no, it's good to be clear about the definitions and we're going to need that as we go through this book. Because sometimes
definitely
there's
are.
confusion about what words mean. And sometimes the authors even seem to introduce that confusion and thrive on it. So, the authors of this book, they definitely, they don't like that story. They don't like that fall story that says, back in the day, before we had agriculture, things were great, and now things suck because agriculture, therefore the state, and therefore, So the project of the book is to explode that story. And you can be the judge about whether they are successful at doing that or not.
And I want to say here, even though we're going to get into more examples as we go through the season, they're troubling that from all sides. They want to show that not all pre-agricultural peoples are free from domination.
Mm-hmm.
And to be fair, any of us who've organized in small groups or even been part of nuclear families understand that a small group still can have bad power dynamics and often does have bad power dynamics.
Yeah.
So that's not news to anybody, right?
Yeah, right.
That just having a small group of people doesn't just mean everybody gets to have some say.
Of course.
You
Yeah,
know?
right.
But
right.
that is part of what's implicit when some of the social theorists are saying that the band was the freest group of people. But then on the flip side, they're also going to be arguing and giving examples that show that there are what they think of as denser groups of people, denser populations, denser settlements that seem to have had relatively more egalitarian or less hierarchical societies.
Right.
That's also something that's going to be up for debate. But I just want to say that they're interested in messing with that assumption that only hunter-gatherers are free and that they are always free from both points of view. that hunter and gatherer societies are necessarily very free, or that bigger societies are necessarily hierarchical.
Yeah, right. Right, for sure. And I'm just going to put my cards on the table right here and say that I do not think that we can't be free because we are not hunter-gatherers.
Well, I will say, I'll put my cards on the table and say that one of the things that I find troubling about the idea that we have to be hunter-gatherers to have less of a chance of dominating each other
right,
is that there are way too many people on Earth for us all to be hunter-gatherers.
Sure.
And what does it mean we don't get to be free without a giant die-off?
Right.
Like, there's not actually a chance for us to make the world that would be a good one for us all to live in, unless there is an even larger catastrophe.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And then the question becomes, if you're going to say, well, that die-off that would be required then is unacceptable, which I think that we both agree on, are you therefore saying that we have to become comfortable with some hierarchy?
Right.
Because, because you'll find people who say this, they'll be like, well, that would require a huge die-off.
Right.
And, we can't all be hunter-gatherers and keep the population that we have now. And so does that then mean that we can not have an egalitarian life?
Right.
And that's the question of this book.
Right.
Great. So with all of that as an introduction, it's time to actually get into chapter 1 and talk about what chapter 1 contains and hear some of their own words. Right. Chapter 1 is called Farewell to Humanity's Childhood, and it really is almost like a microcosm of the book. They lay the groundwork for the arguments and the project of the book in general. Just like the book itself, it's like a real grab bag of like fascinating anecdotes, archaeological tidbits, convincing arguments and otherwise, and just like a lot of, like rhetorical flourish and everything. And so it's a good, it's a good taste of what the whole book is going to deliver. And before we get in, I think that we just need to acknowledge, if this is not clear already, that this book is an extended argument. It's different than the books that we've covered on the podcast so far because they spend a lot of pages actually arguing with different people, arguing with narratives, making their case, and, using evidence and rhetorical strategies and stuff to like make a point, and not just one point, but they have several. And so that's definitely part of what we're going to be engaging with, and part of what we hope that you engage with. If you are reading this book, realize that the people who are writing are trying to convince you of something. And so this is just going to have to be part of the way that we engage with this book and process what's in it.
Right, because this is a theory. And another thing we want to make clear here from the beginning is that Graeber and Wengrow were seeking to start a conversation.
Yeah.
You don't always get that in all of the chapters.
Right.
Sometimes it doesn't. It does seem like they're like shutting down conversation, I will say.
Yeah.
But in general, they say in the introduction that they're wanting to bring a new story, a new interpretation into the world, but they do see that as foundational. And as we move through this, we're going to be responding to that in that way. And so we're going to be like thinking, does this work? Did they make this point? And what are some other ways we might want to think about this as we go? Yeah. So we would encourage the readers to also engage this with a critical mind.
Yeah, for sure. And engage what we're saying with a critical mind, and hopefully this will be generative for you and for us to just like think through some of these questions and some of these stories.
Yeah, for sure.
So, to begin with the beginning of chapter 1, the authors start off the chapter and start off the book by saying most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about the broad sweep of human history, except maybe when they're looking around and noticing what a mess the world is, and they're wondering, how did things get to be like this?
Right.
And then they start right off by introducing us to two basic, almost archetypal templates for conceiving of why the world is the way that it is, politically speaking, and how it got to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
And these are just two basic stories,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not based on research. They're
Mm-hmm.
not historical. They're the result of political philosophy. People in the 16 and 1700s just giving some thought to either critiquing or justifying the world as it was then.
Mm-hmm.
And the two archetypal stories that they want to highlight are familiar probably to a lot of readers. And these are the stories that are associated with the English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes
Mm-hmm.
and the French-speaking political philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yeah. And I think, I was wondering while you were talking about, like, are they archetypal because these two stories were so prominent and continue to be so influential? Or did they tap into a pre-existing way
Yeah.
of thinking about things?
Yeah, they seem to relate to debates. At least at one level, they relate to debates about whether people are inherently good or
Right.
inherently evil.
Mm-hmm.
But that's only one facet of what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like they do reach back further. But the stories told by these two people have just been referenced so often
Mhm.
too that they I think have become almost mythological.
Yeah, or almost just taken as fact, depending on which part of the spectrum
You have more sympathy for,
you have more
or something.
sympathy
Yeah,
for, So
right.
there's also that, like, where there's like myth, where you actually kind of understand that you're taking in a story, an explanatory story, and then there's just like taking something as historical fact, which I think these two stories both exist in some people's minds as historical fact, even though they were created as constructs.
Yeah, I think that's true. So what are these two kind of opposing stories? Thomas Hobbes, we actually talked about a little bit in Caliban and the Witch, as someone who justified, in some ways, early capitalism.
Right. Well, he was a English philosopher who is probably best known for publishing a book called Leviathan that was published in 1651. And he's very much a conservative social theorist. He's someone who, when considering how humans interacted and lived before civilization, before the state,
Mm-hmm.
he basically theorized a sort of like man against man. This is like one of those situations where women aren't really part of the story, but a war against all. It's very much people are violent and selfish, and they
Mhm.
fight for resources, don't really cooperate, and it's just a self-interested war for survival.
Yeah. We should say that both of these political theorists, Rousseau and Hobbes, they're both doing something that a lot of people who were engaged with this political philosophy in this era were doing, and that was that they were using a hypothetical idea of what people were like in a quote-unquote state of nature,
Mm-hmm.
In order to talk about how, the complex stratified monarchical societies that they were a part of, like, came to be. And so the state of nature was this idea where people would project what would it be like if people were just living without any of this.
Mm-hmm.
It was only later that anthropology, archaeology allowed us to historically even speak about human life before civilization with the benefit of actual evidence.
Mm-hmm.
These people were just hypothesizing.
Right.
Well, how did we get to be, okay, well, we're all live under kings and we're part of states and all of this stuff now, but obviously we weren't always. And so we got here from somewhere. What must it have been like before?
Mm-hmm.
And so Hobbes,
His idea was basically that if without someone making you be good or making you not commit violence against your neighbors, then you would be bad.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Hobbes is an authoritarian, which is why we call him politically conservative.
Right.
He believed that there needed to be some strong hand
Mm-hmm.
forcing you to behave,
Right.
basically.
And he thought that before civilization, people had meager lives. His famous quote is that human lives were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So he thought...
That's a long list of...
It's a long list of bad
of
things.
ills, yeah.
And he thought that whatever you might see around you that is loathsome and makes you question the current state of things, it's always an improvement on what happened before.
Yeah.
His assessment was that we were in an improved state under any kind of strong state.
And part of the way that we can think of Hobbes's view as being archetypal or almost mythological is because we can look around and we can see modern day versions of basically the Hobbesian view.
Right.
And Graeber and Wengrow are going to go on to talk about this, and we are too. But, there are people who justify the state and prisons and all of this stuff based on the idea that without them, humans would just run rampant and just be killing each other, basically. And you can even see like modified versions of a sort of Hobbesian take in this idea that one of the beneficial innovations that capitalism brought into reality is that it enables our base human instincts towards greed and selfishness to be harnessed by capitalism to drive the economic engines that people who talk like this usually conceive to be of benefit to all in some way. Right.
And also, it's so wild because you look around and you see how capitalism causes people to be ruthless and selfish and cruel.
Yeah.
And they're like, excellent. This is a really good use of this innate drive. And they would be doing this anyway, but at least we're using it so we can have more stuff.
Yeah, and I think it really takes some rose-colored glasses to look around and see what capitalism has done with the world, and to see that that's like the transformation of bad instincts into just the good things in life.
Right.
Right. Anyway.
So what's the flip side of this?
Yeah. So then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau came about 100 years after Hobbes. At least his most important piece of writing on this topic came 100 years after Leviathan. So Rousseau had read Hobbes and was in part kind of responding to Hobbes. And Rousseau gets a lot of treatment in this book, actually, especially for an essay he wrote called something like The Discourse on the Origins of Social Inequality. And Rousseau's story is a little more subtle. Rousseau begins by famously asking the question, if man was born free, then why is he now everywhere in chains? Rousseau is assuming that in the state of nature, that people lived free lives. And he looked around in the society living in France as he was at the time in the middle 1700s and saw so much bondage, servitude, unfreedom, social hierarchy, misery, and wondered and assumed that it was not always like this. Assumed that there was once a simpler time where people were more free, and then set about to kind of tell a story about how things got to be that way. And in Rousseau's story, it's very different from the Hobbesian view. He has a view of humanity as being kind of intrinsically good. The selfishness, the greed, the violence don't show up in his state of nature. In his state of nature, people do live somewhat solitary lives, or at least in very small groups, but they enjoy freedom, and it's mostly a peaceful time. And then it's only as people start to gather more into bigger groups and start to settle down into villages and towns and then eventually embrace agriculture and start to increase in their population, that is when people progressively become less and less free. Rousseau associated society, like really, he associated people living in larger numbers and being codependent on each other with the constrainment of freedom. So he basically tells a pretty simplistic story about how in this kind of linear way, people just became less and less free.
He uses the word innocent, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, that's right. Innocent in the state of nature.
Yes.
Innocent.
So there's something that's like innocence, which again, there's this rhyming with the Eden story. I don't know what his actual religious beliefs were. I mean, you had to be visibly Christian in that time period.
Right.
But this smells like the fall from Eden, right?
Mm-hmm.
People were innocent, and at a certain point they lose innocence.
Yeah.
And that's through living in larger groups and beginning to farm, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, the innocence part is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, potentially problematic. But yeah, so as you can imagine, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a more sympathetic character for people on the left because he is concerned with this complicated legacy of increasing civilization. And he looked around him and actually saw that there were things about the life that he saw around him that were not ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Hobbes was basically invested in just defending what was and saying how it was the best, it was necessary, it was all for the good. And Rousseau looked around, and even though he was a person of privilege, for sure, he was inclined to wonder if this is the best we could do, And the authors of Dawn of Everything ultimately think that Rousseau is kind of part of the problem, and that's something that we can talk about later. But just to lay out these two archetypes, these are the two archetypes, right? And Rousseau, as I just said, he's not only seen as his story is not just more of sort of a lefty type of story, but he actually is a foundational figure in the creation of the political left. The right and the left in politics, all of this framework emerged out of the French Revolution and what was going on around then. And Rousseau was a huge influence on the French Revolution, his writings. So this is how the book starts, is just by laying out these two basic archetypal stories.
Wingaro and Graeber bring these up, these two dominating theories that are still pretty powerful in the cultural imagination.
Yeah, versions of them.
Yeah.
And they're like, we don't like either of these.
Right. They don't like either one. And so they're trying to propose a third possibility, at least. Or maybe leading to more possibilities.
Yeah, and they want to tell a more hopeful story. And this more hopeful story is evidenced by new evidence that has emerged in the disciplines of archaeology, anthropology, and kindred disciplines about how human societies developed over roughly the last 30,000 years, and that this evidence really makes a problem out of these types of stories. And they're definitely taking aim at the Hobbesian view, but they spend more time targeting the more Rousseauian view, which is more likely to be held by people on the left.
And I think one of the points we haven't really brought up yet, one of the goals of these authors is to show the wide diversity of ways of life that existed all along this timeline that theorists tend to project a pretty linear, progressive narrative of societal change. What they're going to argue with different examples and from both archaeology and anthropology is that humans were always experimenting and trying out different stuff and living in different ways.
Yeah.
That they were in contact with each other a lot more than is generally thought.
Yeah.
And that they were comparing each other's lives, comparing ways of doing things and trying things differently. That there was a lot of experimentation going on.
As they say, the world of hunter-gatherers as it existed before the coming of agriculture was one of bold social experiments resembling a carnival parade of political forms. So, part of what they're going to show us is people having all kinds of ways to be, not just egalitarian ways, even before agriculture. And what could that mean? And they're not into asking about the origins of inequality.
Yeah, no.
In fact, this chapter is subtitled, Why This Is Not a Book About the Origins of Inequality. And they talk about how they had originally set out to write a book about the origins of inequality. And then in the tossing around ideas and doing some research and stuff like that and bringing it in, they decided that that was actually a bad question, maybe like a fatally bad question. And part of what they don't like about the framing of how we got to this awful place offered by Rousseau is that it is self-consciously about equality, because in the beginning we were equal. Not just free, but equal. And they've come to think that like this is actually a counterproductive framing. And I sympathize to an extent with what they're saying, like because what they talk about in here is kind of how wealth inequality and social inequality have become political buzzwords, you might say. And Graeber himself is partially responsible for this, if it's true. I think it is true that he invented, or that he came up with like the cry, like we are the 99%, that was the rallying cry of Occupy Wall Street, because, which just explicitly pits, the top 1% of wealthy people against everybody else, right? So on one hand, we are the 99% is like kind of a statement of class war, and Occupy Wall Street is partially given credit for bringing class consciousness like back into the American left or something. Also, it expresses it, in this way, like equality is about wealth or income or something like that, And what Graeber argues, and I think pretty convincingly, is that like framing equality or framing inequality in this way opens up the door to like all kinds of just what he calls like technocratic sort of tinkering type of solutions. And for those who don't know what the word technocratic means, a technocrat is like a government type official whose job it is to sort of like turn the dials on the economy or on some element of like social control, to try and like make the desired outcomes happen. So technocracy is this very modern way of doing government where, it's like a data-oriented sort of cybernetic type of thing, and where you change the interest rates by 0.1% or something and see what happens to the economy. So those are all technocratic type of solutions, but there are lots of these, right? And it all proceeds from this idea that we live in this like complex system that has a bunch of different controllable inputs on it that we can like set to different variable things and then see what kind of society we get as the outcome,
I was just thinking too that, and I think they're drawing attention to this, but that when you're using equality as a measure and you start throwing around statistics, then it becomes very easy to just try to quantify everything.
Exactly.
And if you're quantifying everything, for one thing, it's not a very accurate measure of like quality of life.
Yeah, right.
But also, you can kind of make the numbers do whatever you want, really.
Yeah, right. Or you can just like have endless sort of conferences and write papers and make targets and like all this stuff about how like our goal is to reduce income inequality by 10% by the end of this decade or something. And it's like we're not talking about meaningful reform of a unjust system that's fundamentally flawed anymore. We're talking about tinkering, like we're talking about adjusting some of the adjustable variables,
right,
to sort of like produce some bigger outcomes maybe someday, and then, because numbers can be massaged and, in favor of the person who's doing the reporting, then that can also lead to all kinds of, hanky-panky about like what's actually counted as progress. So, I completely agree with all of that. Like I totally, and I think that you're totally right to focus on the quantification, because this is part of, they don't say this like in so many words, but it's like when you start talking about inequality as a quantifiable
Right.
type of number, which is part of what you're invited to do once you start to focus on wealth and income, right?
Right.
Which are quantifiable things.
Right.
So their argument kind of goes, they say a word like inequality sounds like it's practically designed to encourage half measures and compromise. It's not even clear what eliminating inequality would mean. And then they say, what kind of inequality? Wealth? Opportunity? Exactly how equal would people have to be in order for us to be able to say that we've eliminated inequality? And this is a part where I kind of like slow down and furrow my brow, because there is a fairly concise definition of inequality, or equality, let's say, in a political sense that could be applied, and that's equality of decision-making power. Like when we're talking about politics is about who has a say and how much say in the way things are done. And so equality in that sphere, which we are talking politics in this book, is about equality of power, decision-making power, to have a say in the system in which you're embedded, right? So when we say that if we say that hunter-gatherers are more or less egalitarian or something, then it means that there aren't stark power differentials about who gets to have their way all the time. We live in a so-called democracy because we all vote. And so nominally, there's this myth of equal amount of power in that way, but we all know, for one thing, the representative democracy means that power is not equally shared. And then also, wealth easily translates into power in our culture, just because the people who own the capital determine the conditions of the rest of our economic lives. And also the people who are very rich can influence politics to a great degree, right? So that is inequality.
Right.
Unambiguously. And it's strange to me that they're trying to like create a bunch of doubt around the meaning of equality or inequality, and I'm not really sure what their motive is there. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or do you even agree with me?
I don't know. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I think we might just want to like hold on to that critique because, as we go through the book, they're going to be giving more examples.
Yeah, well, so we can talk about that more in chapter 2. Folks, we're going to talk about that more when we talk about chapter 2, because this is going to come up again.
We can at least say that from observing the way that things work or have worked in the United States, that when people are using equality as a framework for change is extremely incremental if it happens at all. And I'm wondering if they are seeing that and critiquing that and then going backwards from that. If you frame something around equality or rights, then change is incremental because it's not systematic and it's not foundational. Okay. Well, I don't know. I have no idea if that's what they're doing or not. But
equality, just like freedom, just like any of these big ideas, is a tarnished concept for sure. That's true. And I think that they give some evidence for that. But whenever there's a tarnished concept, there is still the opportunity to reassert the true radical meaning of that concept. Right. Instead of just to be like, what does this even mean anyway? Now that people have done all this stuff with it and they think it means all this other stuff. You could be like, well, what we really mean though is decision-making power. Right. So let's just keep this conversation going. But I think there's something fishy going on. Okay.
We will earmark the fishy distaste for inequality or equality. Okay, so after they do this treatment of inequality, they spend a little bit of time talking about some popular thinkers who they see as currently representing the ideas of Rousseau and Hobbes. It's a little funny. They act like it's a kind of random assortment of people. It's not very random. Their first...
It's like some of the most notorious characters.
Absolutely, A random assortment of generalists talking about social theory. But Francis Fukuyama is the first one. He's a polyscientist who's probably most famous for trying to say that we were in the end of history when the Berlin Wall fell.
Right. And that Western liberal democracies would just
Spread
be
around the
the
world.
permanent form of government over all the globe
Right.
from then on. Very bold claim
Yeah, I
that he
wonder
made in 1991.
how he's doing these days, and
Yeah.
if he's retracted any of that. Maybe I'll look into that.
I think he's modified his position.
It's like maybe not the whole world.
Yeah.
So they talk about him a little bit, and they also talk about Jared Diamond's work in discussing prehistory. Jared Diamond, who, if you guys are listeners to the previous seasons, you know that I don't like to miss an opportunity to talk shit about Jared Diamond myself, and so apparently I'm in the same camp as these guys. But both of them are theorists who might be seen as more like left of center or centrist or something, but they are coming from the Rousseau angle more. Both of them see agriculture as the turning point of when people necessarily move towards more complicated and therefore hierarchical social arrangements.
Mm-hmm.
Partially because they see that population boom that comes along with being able to store up food as requiring governance, if I understand correctly. Is that how you read that?
Yeah, I haven't read these books. Jared Diamond in particular, his argument seems to be almost entirely about scale.
Okay.
And it's just about that large groups of people require hierarchical situations to order them.
Right.
At least that's their summary of his argument. Fukuyama, it's harder to say.
It seems at least like Fukuyama thinks of the like small band, like based on observing primates, like chimpanzees, as to be like the natural social organization. And that once we get up past those numbers, then some level of hierarchy is required. Diamond at least thinks that the small number is the only way that you can have shared power in decision making.
Yeah.
Because then you get to have like face-to-face discussion.
Yeah.
And as we've already mentioned, having a small group of people does not ensure everyone gets to have some say.
Right.
You know, like if any of you have been part of a conversation, even where someone is really good at taking up space and not everyone else is, it like actually takes some work to make sure all the voices are heard.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so yeah, they take aim at Diamond and Fukuyama in this part, and you can see, you know, from what they're doing here, the moves that they are making start to take shape pretty clearly. Because Diamond and Fukuyama are both apologists for our current way of life and our current power structures. They both are in favor of this capitalist liberal democracy thing that we are all kind of living under. Well, we're not all under that, but we're all under capitalism. But they are particularly in favor of, you know, the Western forms of it and more highly developed forms of it, or they're at least defending it against like what would be worse in their eyes or something. And we don't like that. I don't like that. I'm assuming you don't like that. Daver and Grengro definitely don't like that. And so the move that they make in relation to that is, so they don't like Diamond and Fukuyama's conclusions that, well, so obviously we can only be egalitarian if we're still in these small groups of nomadic hunter-gatherers, and so that's just a thing of the past. Oh, well, better live with what we've got. They don't like that conclusion. And so their choice about how to refute that line of reasoning is to fight with the proposition that early humans were egalitarian, right? Because that's what they've been setting up this whole time. They're going to be like, we're going to take you back in time and show you all these non-egalitarian situations that happened in early humanity. So that's their strategy for like undermining this kind of thinking. And I just want to put that on the table. Right. Because it occurs to me that there could be other ways of arguing with these people, but this is the way that they've chosen, you know, or like one of the main ways.
Yeah, and on the other side of this popular discourse, as they're moving to talk about the more conservative range of social theory in contemporary popular books, they're addressing the work of Steven Pinker, who wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined in 2012. He also wrote Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress in 2018. His thing is more about the emergence of cities, less about agriculture, although he's got some of that in there too. I think it's more about like concentrations of people. So once again, kind of like Diamond a little bit, although Diamond has the agriculture part in there. Pinker thinks that if there are many people around, since they're at heart selfish and acting out of self-interest, then concentrations of people is going to increase the likelihood of abuse and random domination and random violence. And he would argue that this is why we have to have states. And his whole book seems to be more about the need for a state or the need to have governance because we have to actually have something keeping people from hurting each other.
Yeah.
Even though that it means the state is going to have violence at many levels, they get to have the violence.
Right, totally.
I mean, he probably doesn't come out and say it exactly like that, but...
Yeah, Pinker is their example of, like, a modern-day Hobbesian, and so, like, he doesn't sound super right-wing, but he's definitely making right-wing arguments about
law and order,
the necessity of law and order and a state to impose law and order on the population, more or less, in the context of this big defense that he's doing about, you know, he thinks he has data, I haven't read this book, that shows that violence has actually declined and, you know, life expectancy has improved and like all these things, but he's basically, you know, he's saying this has all been for the good. The order that we are living under now, this is moving in the right direction. It's improving people's lives on average.
He's definitely a good example of someone who is tinkering with the numbers to make a point.
Yeah, right.
You know? Right. So we wanted to draw up a couple examples from Pinker's thing, even though we're not going to go into great detail about this part. But, you know, he does bring up very specific examples from archaeology and anthropology, even though, like, he is this huge proponent of science. He does not lean very heavily on science at all to make his arguments.
Yeah.
But he does find use a find here or there if he wants to prove a point. And so he brings up the very famous finding of Ötzi, the Tyrolean Iceman, whose body was found in the Alps in 1991. Is that where he was found?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's right, in the Alps. He was like frozen and almost perfectly preserved inside like a glacier or something. Some hikers, they looked over at the ice and they saw like a dark shape in it and there was a man in there, and it turned out that he died like 5,000 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's how old he is.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he's an interesting find for a lot of reasons. He definitely was found with a wound in his shoulder or somewhere, like he had
an arrow in him, and that's
that
he died from. Yeah.
He also had like a little pouch with some lichen and like a polypore mushroom or something in it. I know that like herb folks are like excited about the fact that he was carrying around this stuff.
Well, it's pretty fascinating because it's like a nearly prehistoric person.
Right.
You know, I mean, not like super ancient, but like from a culture that's not very well documented. But there's a lot of artifacts of the culture he was a part of still on him that are well preserved. And I believe he has tattoos, maybe.
Yeah.
You know, they've taken apart his stomach and they know what his last meal was. And, you know, all of this.
He'd eaten some kind of grain or something, right?
Stuff. Yeah, I think there was a rabbit in there. And they've put together this whole story about like his last couple of days because anyway, it looks like he fled from his village into the mountains and had to like live off, he had to hunt and subsist, you know, because he was fleeing potentially from some violence, but then people were pursuing him and came and eventually got him. You know, I think I learned all this from Radiolab. Is that right?
Yeah.
There's like a Radiolab episode about Ötzi. I think I'm recalling that now. But yeah, so Pinker's basically like, he's like, I mean, take this Ötzi guy, right? I mean, why can't we find like a dead guy without there being like an arrow in him or having his skull crushed in by a blunt object, you know? And so, you know, he's like, on one hand, he thinks he's bringing in all this objective data, but then he'll throw in an anecdote like that. Yeah, and then Graeber and Wengrow counter that example with, they accuse Pinker of cherry-picking examples and being like, well, you know, of course you can point to people who died by violence, but how about this other find at this site called Romito II? This is now a 10,000-year-old burial, and it's a rather elaborate for its time burial of somebody who experienced a severe type of dwarfism, acromesomelic dysplasia. Like basically, long story short, what becomes clear from analyzing, the person and the burial and everything is that although this person was presumably maybe a liability to the band that they were traveling with in terms of like a more sort of Darwinian notion of fitness, that they were cared for and were just like part of the band like everybody else for quite a long time.
And given
right?
a burial.
And given a burial, which is, they have a part in a subsequent chapter that actually shines more light on these like burials of unusual individuals and how that's a pattern that's seen through time. So that's interesting. But yeah, so like part of their point is that like care and maybe even like a level of altruism that social Darwinism would not predict or whatever was also typical, at least, in some cases, or at least in this case, right? But if you're just going to pick out random anecdotes, then you could pick out this one too, and it tells a different story than what Pinker is trying to tell, which is that, people are just always killing each other.
Right. Right. Yeah, because what they're seeing, I mean, and this is actually something that's just in so many of the debates in all of the sciences, people are accused of bringing their own politics in because you can't separate your framework and your perception from what findings you find interesting and from what story that you're creating out of it, And I'm sure there are plenty of people who think that Graeber and Wengrow are cherry picking and only including some data, as well.
Right.
But, we're going to just for now take what they're saying at face value. A
different, if I can just say, like a different anthropologist looking at these two same little anecdotal stories might find it noteworthy that Ötzi, who died by violence, lived in a farming village.
Right.
And the Romito II burial was a burial of hunter-gatherers who lived in the Calabrian. And we know that this is something that maybe this book is here to dispute, but it's typically thought that more violence and raiding and war and like proto-war and all of that became more common once people ceased to be nomadic, settled down and started practicing agriculture. And so there is something there that it's like not inconsistent with a certain type of interpretive lens.
Right.
Also, these are just two anecdotes, and so you can't like really tell all the story of history from that. But it's interesting that like that's not part of the lens that they're bringing in.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing that I was thinking of was actually like evolutionary biology and how even within that, which might seem, I don't know, less interpretive, it's actually quite interpretive. But
yeah,
there was this like long-standing feud between professional atheist Richard Dawkins and and Stephen Jay Gould, and so because Dawkins had like a very kind of intense version of fitness theory as part of his mindset when looking at evolutionary biology, while Stephen Jay Gould was very influenced by Kropotkin and the theories of mutual aid and cooperation as a factor in evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever he would write about that, Dawkins would just be like, "You're just a Marxist." Like whatever, Marxist.
Right.
Even though cooperation exists and there's a lot of examples of it, you know. And while I might be like, yeah, Dawkins, you also have a political lens. It's the air around us, so you can't recognize it, right? I'm bringing that up just to say, like, every field of science allows for some level of, like, your political lens is definitely going to make you
absolutely
see things a certain way. Mm-hmm. This is also happening in this book.
Yeah.
It just might be that I agree more often than with other choices and frameworks.
Yeah.
Although I don't always agree, Or
at least the goals.
The goals.
Agree with the goals. Yeah.
So,
not to defend, capitalism and shit.
Just to say that, like, that's, like, they're not free from that, but it's just interesting to read their examples in here of, like, anthropologists screaming at each other.
Yeah, and so we're actually getting to the end of the chapter here. This is kind of the home stretch. After discussing Ötzi and Romito II, Graeber and Wengrow move on to talking about the Yanomami, and this chapter is turning out to really contain an all-star cast. because the Yanomami are one of the most famous indigenous groups in the whole world, or famous to people in the West, to the educated West, partially because, and they talk about this in the book, there was a anthropologist named Napoleon Chagnon, who, despite what his name sounds like, was actually an American anthropologist who spent a lot of time hanging out with these people who live in the Amazon rainforest. He wrote a book called The Yanomamo, The Fierce People, which made them really famous, was really popular outside of academic circles, and there was a movie about the Yanomami, and the Yanomami have gotten a lot of attention. Napoleon Chagnon portrays them as being like kind of obsessed with weapons and violence, so that's part of their reputation. And somewhat more obscurely, the Yanomami are also well known by some folks from a couple of books written by the French anthropologist Pierre Clastres, one of which is called Society Against the State, where he argues that a kind of rudimentary form of primitive warfare that is generally non-lethal that the Yanomami practiced actually was a way for them to self-consciously prevent the emergence of the state and more hierarchical forms of domination. So the Yanomami have been much discussed, and they are coming up here in this book again. Pinker apparently tries to use them as, once again, an example of uncivilized, I guess, people who are prone to violence.
Yeah.
And, there's like a argument to be had apparently about how violent the Yanomami actually are. Pinker opens the door to Graeber and Wengrow's critique by quoting a woman named Helena Valera, who was a Brazilian woman of Spanish descent who was abducted by the Yanomami in 1932. And Pinker apparently quotes her.
She described one of their raids, the violence of one of their raids that she was around for.
Okay, yeah. Described the violence of their raids. And Graeber and Wengrow point out that this is kind of ironic for him to invoke Helena Valero because she was abducted by the Yanomami, lived with them for a time.
She actually, she rose to some power within the tribe. She married a couple times. She had a life there. And then eventually as an adult, after some time, she decided to go back to where she was from because to see family or to go to the city or something, and wrote a book about her experience.
She abandoned the Yanomami to seek her natal family.
Yeah.
Went back to her Western life and then chose to go back to live with the Yanomami. And not only that, but they point out that there's actually lots of examples of this.
And there's so many examples of this, especially from the first couple hundred years of colonization.
Oh, yeah.
So many examples of people who either just settlers who chose to just go and live with indigenous folks because they found the conditions of life better there.
Mm-hmm.
But also, just times when indigenous kids would sometimes be raised by colonists, and then they would get to choose which place they decided to live.
Right.
And they would often go back, and there's a really interesting quote from Benjamin Franklin, actually, about this. I don't know if you want to read it or you want me to read it.
Boy, it is really good. When an Indian child has been brought up among us, taught our language, and habituated to our customs, yet if he goes to see his relations and make one Indian ramble with them, there is no persuading him ever to return. And that this is not natural merely as Indians, but as men, is plain from this, that when white persons of either sex have been taken prisoner by the Indians and lived a while among them, though ransomed by their friends, and treated with all imaginable tenderness to prevail them to stay among the English, yet in short time they become disgusted with our manner of life, and the care and pains that are necessary to support it, and take the first opportunity of escaping again into the woods, from whence there is no reclaiming them. One instance I remember to have heard, where the person was to be brought home to possess a good estate, but finding some care necessary to keep it together, he relinquished it to a younger brother, reserving to himself nothing but a gun and a match coat, with which he took his way again to the wilderness.
That's the thing. There was printing at this point. There were interviews. There were books written about these people or by these people who had lived in both societies and then chose indigenous society.
Yeah.
And generally the common threads are that people found that they preferred the relative freedom of living amongst indigenous society
Yeah.
including sexual freedom, but that was not the only freedom, but that was definitely one of them.
Totally.
But also...
The absence of toil?
Yes, the freedom from constant toil.
Toil is like, that word gets used a lot.
In pursuit of land and wealth.
Yeah.
Because they kind of are like, this is actually not valuable. I prefer what is of value in this other culture.
Right.
Which is my time.
Right. Yeah.
And so what you guys are working towards doesn't even mean anything to me anymore.
Yeah.
And why do I have to do that? Benjamin Franklin might call that the care it took to run the house, but what does that actually mean? Like the care it takes to have the life that was expected amongst the settlers was a lot of work, and some of it seemed apparently worthless to the people who had lived in both cultures. And then also, a lot of the people who compared the two and chose indigenous life talked about the community care of all the members.
Oh yeah, can I actually read this part too?
Yeah, please.
I love this part of this chapter intensely, and this part is just so great. It says, by far the most common reasons, so this is Graeber and Wengrow speaking, by far the most common reasons, however, had to do with the intensity of social bonds they experienced in Native American communities, qualities of mutual care, love, and above all, happiness, which they found impossible to replicate once back in European settings. Security takes many forms. There is the security of knowing one has a statistically smaller chance of getting shot with an arrow. And then there's the security of knowing that there are people in the world who will care deeply if one is.
Yeah, so many of the narratives that you read like that, people just talk about how lonely they are in the settler communities.
Yeah.
And that loneliness. So loneliness, work, and absence of freedom. And again, since you read that, I just want to highlight, as I said earlier, that it's important for us to remember that when we hear the word freedom over and over again here, it is not one without responsibility. It is tied in with community care and mutual care. It just means there aren't people over you telling you what to do.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that part is deeply inspiring, and that people would go back and forth and just see the scarcity of care in the settler communities. It's just really moving.
Yeah. And the contrast between indigenous American cultures and European culture is going to be expanded on a lot more in chapter 2, really brilliantly. So be ready for that. It's quite a treat, actually.
All right, so there's one last section in chapter 1 that we need to talk about.
That's right.
And in this section, the authors are talking about a trend that they see in social theory going back to this time of European thought experiments about the history of mankind. But they also see this sort of trend continue today. And it's a kind of flattening of indigenous peoples and ways of life, basically. And part of the flattening, at least in those initial thought experiments, is about kind of oversimplifying to be able to make a story, to make sense out of stuff, to come up with insights by simplifying.
Yeah, and I think I would say they're making an observation about social theory in general.
Sure.
And just about, because some of their examples are like Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud, about people who do social theory, and how part of what's necessary to say anything new and interesting, kind of, or to talk about patterns, is to simplify reality.
Right.
To kind of strip it down to something more simple than the complex thing that is going on, and that major contributions to social theory almost necessarily simplify the world in order to make sense of it. And remember, they're referring kind of specifically still to Hobbes and Rousseau, and how they both told sort of neat little stories, tidy little stories about how we got here in the history of humanity as a thought experiment or to serve an educational purpose. So that's what they're talking about.
Yeah, and what they're trying to get at with this criticism, though, even though they say that sometimes this is necessary, what they've also seen is sometimes these thought experiments and simplifications stick and start to actually stand in for historical fact.
Yeah, totally. We get stuck in the simplification.
Right. And so then what started as a let's just say it was like this, in the way that Rousseau does, starts to become just what people accept as actually the way history went down in the time before there was history. And then more specifically, part of what Wengrow and Graeber are trying to draw attention to in this part is the fact that our assumptions about how the world works, it's very easy for us to project upon the past or to see evidence for.
Yes.
And so we're constantly reinforcing our own belief systems. And unless we question those assumptions, question what we've been told, question what we think is the natural order of things, quote unquote, then we are likely to have all of the findings and our interpretation of them reinforce the status quo or how we think the world works.
Yeah, it's really easy to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess probably some critics of the authors may think they are doing that as well, but we'll be getting to that another time.
Right.
So an example they give of this phenomenon is the finding of evidence or interpretation of evidence to promote the seeds of capitalism that people have been doing at least as far back as Adam Smith. So any apologists or theorists about why capitalism is inevitable are going to look through anthropological findings or through archaeological digs and see evidence for proto-trade or little examples of ways that something that would eventually become capitalism has always been part of human culture.
Yeah, to show that capitalism is just but a natural outgrowth of things that people have always done.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So what they would do is usually see special items, whether those are shells or beads, feathers, or jewelry, and they would see these far from where they originated and say, see this here, this is evidence of trade. This is primitive trade that will one day bloom into full-blown capitalism.
Right.
And so what Graeber and Wengrow are getting at here is that is an example of a theorist who is so inundated with one way of doing things, he can't actually imagine other ways of doing things.
Yeah.
And there is ample evidence that these special items have moved around in many, many other kinds of ways that had nothing to do with commerce.
Mm-hmm.
And so this section is them providing you some examples of that kind of movement of special things.
Yeah.
I keep calling them special things because whenever I try to think of a better word, it still rhymes with money too much or something.
Uh-huh.
So if I say tokens or
yeah. Yeah.
So special things is going to continue to be what I'm calling them. But they give a few examples of items that have been moved around a lot in prehistory.
Right. They might be beads or items of adornment or stuff that was, there's a lot of, I don't know what anthropologically, if there's a term for these types of things, which they're not strictly functional in the sense of something you would use to pound a nut to crack the shell or something, but they were valuable nonetheless.
Yes.
Or, special and collected and maybe, had a different kind of function.
Right.
Potentially. Yeah.
Any of us who are prone to walk through the woods and just pick up pretty rocks or special
exactly. I keep thinking
items.
about that. Yeah.
Or not.
Right.
It's not hard for us to come up with.
We still collect these things and pass them around and gift them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And this is, they make quite a point of saying that to relentlessly project our current ways of living into the past, and to only see dim reflections of this world that we live in, when we look into the past, is not only inaccurate, but it makes the study of history very dull.
Right.
Because you're looking into the past not to see something new, but only to see something familiar.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And then they provide 3 examples of various peoples of Turtle Island moving goods around. Or I shouldn't even say goods, maybe special items around without commerce.
Yeah.
And
this part is really fascinating, I think.
It's really interesting. So one example is something that European visitors or observers saw amongst the Iroquoian peoples. And it was that if someone in one of those groups dreamt of an object, or an animal, even in some cases. It said maybe even a dog.
A dog, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If someone dreamt of an item or an animal that someone that a friend or neighbor or a relative in a adjoining area had, then they could go to that person and ask for the item or for the animal. And it was very important to actualize what happened in your dreams.
Right.
So if you dreamt of something, you were supposed to go get it. And then the person, presumably on the other end, was expected to give that item up if someone dreamt of it.
Right. Yeah. There's not a lot of detail, but they talk about how it's possible to go on actually
a pretty long trip.
Long journey to try and locate. Because maybe you didn't already know exactly where it was, but you dreamt of a dog of a certain color and all this stuff, and you had to go like find that dog and, make the dream come true.
Make the dream come true.
Because in the dream, the dog was your dog or something.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's one way that special items might move around.
Yeah.
That was well documented.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was also a tradition of traveling healers and performers. And for this, they are drawing on the memoir of Cabeza de Vaca, who was a Spaniard who shipwrecked, who his story is pretty fascinating on its own. There's not a lot of it in here, but he's worth a look. But he shipwrecked up, I think, on the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, and he was kind of on his own for quite some time, but he found out that he could make his way through the Southwest from one indigenous town to another by acting as kind of a traveling healer, but kind of like healer, magician. It's kind of like a performative healer,
right.
You get the feeling. And he didn't invent this role. It was already a role and like a kind of person. He was able to successfully, like, I don't know if imitate is the word, but perform that role.
Right. Well, yeah, and so often when you would do that kind of work or like performance healing work.
Yeah, from what he reports, it's like people would sort of shower you with tokens of appreciation.
Right. Totally.
When you did that, but it wasn't the cost.
Right.
Of doing the thing.
Right.
It was something else.
Yeah.
But then he would keep on moving and you could go span quite some distance. And those tokens could even be redistributed down the line.
Right.
Right? Or left in places as he makes friends and like all these things too. And, he or whoever is this person, but we know about this one person who did
right.
that. So, and it's just like, it's not like they're proposing another model. It's just all these little, very specific, historically specific examples, and the implication is that like the world is full of surprising examples.
Yeah.
And it can't just be reduced to one pattern.
Oh yeah, because their last example, which I had never heard this before I read this book, but there's a lot of documentation of this very like vibrant gambling culture among the women of various parts of Turtle Island, the indigenous women of Turtle Island, and that women would spend a lot of time gambling these little beads, but you couldn't trade them for anything else. You couldn't buy anything. You couldn't
You wouldn't trade them for a pile of corn or something that you needed like that. It was not currency.
No.
Yeah.
It was just for gambling.
Just something you would gamble.
And so they played these gambling games, and some of those tokens would move great distances as well, as people traveled around and gambled with each other.
Yeah, because you would sometimes meet with people of the adjacent village.
Totally.
And gamble with them, whatever, and then you'd split up, and then, but there was lots of villages, so things could slowly move quite some distance this way by being gambled.
Right.
Yeah.
So the point here being, European social theorists of that era and since, and now I would also say some American social theorists of European descent, might see those the stories of the beads, see the items that have moved around, see the records of them, see them in museums, and be like, so here we have proto money, and that's what they're pushing up against. They want to push back against the idea that there was a linear story. We had to show up here, and the seeds are always there.
Yeah,
and this is just one example.
Right.
Of that. But if all you can see is I'm looking for the root of this system, then that is what you're going to see.
Yeah, there's a word for that specific thing.
Right.
It's called teleology.
That's true.
Which is a strange word, but it's a word. The telos it's Greek, right? The telos is the end. So it's like to see everything that you're looking at in light of where it leads. Right. So because we know that we have money now and that currency developed at some point, then to interpret everything you see in the past only in light of the role it played that you're assuming that it did play in kind of forming eventually money in the way that we know it now.
Right.
You know, and teleology is something that is always to be critiqued.
The shorthand for me has always been like, because this did happen, it had to have happened.
Yeah.
And so I just have to explain how it happened.
Yeah.
Not why or what else could have happened.
Yeah. And I love this. I've always been fascinated by the little backwaters of history and the experiments that maybe didn't succeed, but were still grand and wonderful and inspiring for the duration that they did exist. And the pockets of things that seem to prove that the larger trajectories of histories were not, in fact, inevitable, you know, and to give a window into the way that things could have been. I've always been obsessed with learning about that stuff, and it's been such a big intellectual curiosity of mine. And so I'm very much with what they're trying to do here, you know, and that lesson. They're deploying it in one way that I think is really interesting, though, and kind of unexpected, and that I have like a question about that I kind of want to leave us with here at the end. And it has to do with their promise that they've made a couple different times in this very early chapter, that they're going to show us that people who lived without agriculture, otherwise known as foragers or hunter-gatherers, did not uniformly live these egalitarian lives, the way that Rousseau says and the way that we hear in other contexts as well. And that instead their lives were a carnival parade of political forms, right? Typified by bold social experiments. And they portray this experimentation with political forms in a very positive light, as part of almost like what makes us human. It's an expression of our innate human creativity to be able to come up with all of these different kind of political forms and to experiment with them. And to them, this is a more exciting reality, a more positive, a reality that is more fitting to our struggles for liberation than to look into the past before agriculture and see a predominance of egalitarian relations. So far, so good. But the question that this raises for me, and it's not something that's going to have an answer right now, but it's just something that I want to put on the table, is that when they're talking about experimenting with different political forms besides egalitarianism, what they're talking about is people choosing, because this is all about agency and free choice for them, that people are choosing to live with various versions of hierarchy and or domination or coercion, however you want to word that, right? Because it's something that's not egalitarian. Right. They're very clearly talking about political diversity. You know, they're not just talking about, you know, different ways to cook meat or like different ways to adorn yourself or different ways to have a ritual or different, you know, cultural things.
Except when those tie into power.
Yeah, but I mean, this is a book of politics.
Right.
And it's a book about how people organize themselves, and it's a book about power. And they're saying, like, isn't it more exciting and more liberating to be able to see people as having experimented with different political forms, you know, instead of the other story, which is that we were mostly egalitarian before agriculture came, you know, but to experiment with non-egalitarian political forms, what they're basically talking about is people choosing, and whatever choice means in this context, hey, how about we experiment with a system where if there's not enough to eat, then like y'all are the ones who get to eat to your fill and we don't. Right. Or how about we experiment with a system where there's a certain class of people that does the laborious work, and then there's another class of people who kind of talk about it and direct the work.
Or get to make art.
or I get to make art
Mm-hmm.
or ritual alongside that work.
Mm-hmm.
Or let's experiment with a system where the women don't get to choose who they have sex with.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it's the men who do, or the strong men who do.
Right.
Something, right? I mean, these are all a little bit, they're not really exaggerated
They're not
examples.
really exaggerated
They're,
examples.
because where a society is not egalitarian, some things like this are happening.
Right.
Right? Because gender, along the lines of sex and gender, is where domination in so many situations first starts to show up.
Right.
Right? So
I guess, like, you're trying to say, like, it's great to think that we can be free to choose and people get to decide what kind of society they're going to have. And they're going to provide a lot of examples of that happening.
mhm.
But if we think that, then we have to also acknowledge that people chose these systems of domination and unfair setups, or things that we might judge as being not great ways to live.
And who would choose that?
Right.
You know, it's like, I mean, there's a whole other thing, which is, what does it mean for a people to choose
Right.
what their political formation is going to be,
Mm-hmm.
right? Especially if it's one where there's going to be some subjugated or dominated people.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like the ones who chose that was the way things were going to be was probably not those dominated people.
Right.
There was probably a power struggle of some kind,
Right.
and a certain class of people came out on top.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just way different than people choose how they get to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's like, already at the beginning of the book, there's this fundamental, like, what am I not understanding about what they're trying to say? Or what are they not understanding about what seems kind of obvious about choice?
Right.
And
Or what are they leaving out for now, for the sake of their thought experiment?
oh yeah, maybe
What are they simplifying?
maybe that's how we need to.
I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, this is going to keep coming up. And I mean, definitely as you bring up the patriarchy/misogyny element, it's probably going to be haunting us throughout the book.
Uh-huh.
But, you know, it's possible that they've explained this thing, like, social theorists have to do this, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, so we're getting ready to do that.
Right.
But I don't know. It's a good question.
We're just gonna have to, let's just leave that question on the table.
Right.
And we're probably gonna circle back around to this in various ways. Or we're gonna have to I'm just gonna keep this question alive.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see what the book reveals down the line.
Yeah. So as we leave off this week, we want to leave you all with a little bit of an assignment, something to think about until we meet again. And this book has us thinking about and questioning our own assumptions and stories that we tell ourselves about the history of humanity. And so we thought it might be useful for you, listener, to think about it too. What stories do you tell about the history of humans, about how we got where we are? What do you assume about what is possible? And I think maybe also, how do you think change happens? And what are the conditions in which we might be capable of making change?
And more specifically to this book, I might add, what do you think is the relevance of looking to prehistoric people? What do their lives have to teach us now? And is there a story that you've been told or that you tell yourself about what happened to the people of old that leads to the predicament that we're in today?
Yeah. It might be worth your time to jot some of that down, maybe take a couple notes. I don't know. Whatever helps you get those kind of thoughts moving around, makes you examine your own frameworks, because I think that part of what we're going to be doing is examining our own frameworks, the frameworks of these authors, the frameworks that they are criticizing, and some other people's ways of seeing the world as well.
Yeah, this book gets into those questions, and it has some arguments to make. And so it's probably good, before you subject yourself to someone else's arguments, to check in with what you even think.
Yeah.
So that you can compare the two.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
All right.
All right, next time.
And with that, we'll see you next time.
When we sing it is through the emptiness. When the sun falls on our eyes, we are silent. Joy is the day, quiet is walking into thinking. Dark is the night and up into dancing. Watch us